Thank you very much. Our Prime Minister is now with us. You may take your seats. The Honorable Mia Moore-Motley, Prime Minister of Barbados, members of Cabinet, Professor Dan Esty, Yale University, and co-lead for the Remaking Trade project, Professor Joel Trachtman of Tufts University, also co-lead for the Remaking Trade project, Professor Winston Moore, Deputy Principal, University of the West Indies, Cave Hill Campus, Mr. Christopher Sambrano, Managing Partner, Ernst & Young, Caribbean, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Mr. Kevin Greenidge, Governor of the Central Bank, Sir Paul Altman, Chairman of the Campus Council, members of the university community, Srinath Ramphal Center board members, event sponsors, participants, and specially invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Janive Remy, and I will be your mistress of ceremonies at this welcome event and cocktail reception for the workshop entitled Trade and Climate Action, Shifting the Paradigm for a Just Transition and Sustainable Development. In my day job, I serve as director of the Srinath Ramphal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy, and Services, we call it the SRC, at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. The SRC is the Caribbean's premier center for training future leaders of trade for the region, and we are proud to have embarked also on this mission to champion research, advocacy, and be a force for change in the realm of trade and sustainability. Which brings me to why we are all gathered here today. Without being melodramatic, the reason for it is that I said yes. No, not in that way. Let me recount briefly the story. Almost 1 year ago, sitting in Lake Geneva during the SRC's annual study tour where we take our students on a master's trade policy course for 2 weeks to Geneva, I met up with a well-known professor, Professor Dan Esty of Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. He recounted to me that the newly elected WTO Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, had invited him to join her on secondment at the Trade and Environment Division of the WTO. He told me that with him was another colleague, Professor Joel Trachtman, who's also here, and that they were engaged in a project entitled Remaking Global Trade for a Sustainable Future. And he asked me, would you like to join us? Now, I said yes. He explained to me that the idea of the project was to rethink the foundations for international commerce and develop a WTO reform agenda to better position the WTO to meet the current needs and better align the trade system with the Sustainable Development Goals. Since saying yes, I have never regretted that decision. 1 year later, together with Dan, Diana Van Patten of Yale University, Joel, and his colleague, Dean of Tufts University's Fletcher School of Diplomacy, Dean Rachel Kite, I am proud to be one of the co-leaders of the project on Remaking Global Trade. And what is it that we do? We bring our crusade for reforming the WTO to policymakers, academics, business people, young people, NGOs, and civil society, people who want to make a change in all corners of the globe, so that we bring trade experts together with other subject matter specialists, whether in finance, the environment, digitization, social policy, climate, the circular economy, all of these areas where sustainability has the potential to intersect or clash with trade policy. and we lock them in a room for 3 days and ask them to come up with the best results for the trade system. We typically target 35 to 40 unsuspecting victims, invite them to a beautiful location around the world so it is hard for them to say no, and then we tell them, make the trade system better. So far, we've brought our crusade to Talois, France, India, the Alps, Taormina, we were there last week, and we have Copenhagen, Mexico, Geneva to go just in this summer. So that explains why we're here in Barbados. Apart from the obvious, a beautiful location, there are two other compelling reasons we decided to come to Barbados. Climate change is the biggest sustainability issue confronting our times. And we believe that the Global South's response to it is worthy of the attention of the project. Second, and the real reason people came here, is because we have a leader who is both a champion of the cause of sustainability and has also brought the movement of sustainability to the area of reform of finance through her powerful words and the Bridgetown Agenda. We want the project to learn from, extend what has been achieved by the Bridgetown Agenda. This morning, when I opened up the newspaper, I discovered a third reason. Either by serendipity or by design, I saw that yesterday, May Day, the Prime Minister unveiled her declaration of Mission Barbados, which is all about what our project is about, making Barbados more sustainable. We are happy to see that one of the signatories of the declaration, Ms. Tricia Tannis, chair of the Barbados Private Sector Association, is also here with us. Prime Minister, you will be happy to know that our project has a workshop on the blue economy, your first objective in making Barbados more clean and a beautiful large ocean state by 2030. And we also will cater to your objective 5 and 6 to promote Barbadian workers, reduce poverty, facilitate digital inclusion. That's our workshop in Mexico on sustainability, trade, and the social dimensions. Yes, we have chosen the right place for this workshop. From tonight, at a dinner session, the workshop participants who have gathered here will be chewing very hard on the topic we've given them this time. How can the WTO be more responsive to the sustainability imperatives and needs of developing countries when it comes to climate and climate action? We will be challenging them to tackle issues such as technology transfers, intellectual property rights, financing and trade, investment, competitiveness, carbon markets and standards. And more importantly, what is the WTO and trade's role in bringing sustainability to developing countries? So we are set on a task. Let me welcome you, our participants from the region and internationally, some of whom are flying in as we speak, gathered here today as we welcome and facilitate an environment where the local government, the local community meets and inspires the workshop participants to dream big. Welcome, everyone. I exhausted so much of the time. I know the Prime Minister doesn't have a lot of time, but I'm going to ask one of the co-leads of the project, Professor Dan Esty, to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the project. Dan?
Genevieve, thank you very much. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy day and busy lives to be here with us. It really is an enormous joy for us to be in Barbados. And I want to just thank Genevieve and the entire University of the West Indies team. What an extraordinary job you guys have done. We are gathered, as Genevieve has said, at a very critical moment. A critical moment that the Prime Minister has talked about, a critical moment that all of you who've come from across the world to be part of this conversation over the next 3 days are aware of. You can say it's a watershed moment. And from my perspective, it's a question of whether we go forward together on a sustainable basis towards a sustainable future that addresses the polycrises that we face as a world community, including the need to re-gear our international financial architecture for a sustainable future, which Prime Minister Motley has really been on the lead in pushing for. And I'm sure all of you know she will be in Paris next month with President Macron, bringing the world community together to address that very issue. But we want to say that our effort of remaking the global trading system, we think of as a parallel initiative. We might even say a sister project, aiming to ensure not only that the financial architecture, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the multilateral development banks, and all of the private capital that flows in parallel with that effort, not only is that re-geared, but the trading system as well. Must have new foundations, commitment to sustainability at the very core, new economic models of greater inclusivity, greater transparency, and a greater commitment to serving the broad needs of people in all societies across the world. So we are going to be gathered with an enormous agenda in front of us. I do think we can move the trading system towards this sustainable future in parallel with a remaking of the global financial architecture, but it is not going to be easy. And for those who came with high expectations, we won't finish by the end of the week. But we will start, and the start is important, and the building of an effort that can gather momentum over time is extraordinarily valuable. And I just want to close with a bit of appreciation for our partners in making this all happen, because it does not happen without extraordinary teams of people all across various institutions of society. And I just want to thank the Open Society Foundations that are here today with us, one of our funders. We also have funding from the Loudis Foundation, from the European Climate Fund, from the Bezos Foundation, from the Skoll Foundation, and we have partners as well who work with us on various of these workshops, which we are, as you heard from Jean-Yves, carrying out across the world to try to drive the agenda towards this sustainable future. And we've got the Silverado Policy Accelerator here. We have partners not here today, but have been with us in recent workshops from the Villar Institute. We have Oxford University that did an important workshop with us earlier this year, and we could not do it alone. So yes, it's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, the University of the West Indies, Yale, that are part of this, but so many others. So thank you all who are part of this effort. And for anyone here tonight, we put you on the list of the friends and partners of this project, and we ask you to help us think about how we bring this world together for a sustainable future. Thank you all very, very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. And we will be thanking all our collaborators at the end, at closing. I'm now going to ask Professor Winston Moore to bring some remarks on behalf of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus.
Allow me to adopt protocol, but allow me to also specially recognize the Honorable Mia Moore-Motley, the Governor of the Central Bank, the Honorable Ryan Strachan, Minister of Finance, and members of the Diplomatic Corps, and other specially invited guests, members of the media. You're all welcome. We are very happy to welcome you to today's ceremony, because I think this is what universities do. Universities play a vital role in society by providing access to higher education and the advancement of knowledge. They're responsible for educating the next generation of leaders, thinkers, and problem solvers, and for conducting cutting-edge research that drives innovation as well as economic growth. They play a critical role in fostering cultural and intellectual exchange and promoting the free exchange of ideas and the pursuit of truth. Additionally, universities often act as a bridge, partnering with local organizations and businesses to address social and economic issues. They also serve as a cultural center for their communities, hosting events, lectures, and exhibits that promote the arts and humanities. It's therefore fitting that this event is being hosted by 3 universities, and one of them being the University of the West Indies. And it's also fitting that it's being held in the 60th anniversary of the University of West Indies Cave campus. In 1963, the Cave campus started with just 118 students at the Deepwater Harbor. This year, we have around 6,600 students registered at the Cave campus. The University of the West Indies as a whole itself is celebrating its 75th year of existence within the Caribbean. And the university has made a significant impact on the region as a whole. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had an entire lecture on the impact of the University of the West Indies. I wouldn't bore you with that lecture. You can go and look at it on the university's website. But I think tonight's topic, and this seminar's topic is so important because it captures and it impacts on Caribbean states in a fundamental way. The Prime Minister has spoken about this in a number of different fora, and one of the things that you would see when you look at the research is that small states like the Caribbean, like those in the Caribbean, are going to be fundamentally impacted by climate change. And trade policy can play a fundamental role in changing the dynamics and the policies that we implement in these countries. There is a policy paper that has already been formulated by the Schuder-Fraenfeld Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services, and I want to congratulate them for developing that working paper. It makes 4 key recommendations in relation to trade negotiations and how trade negotiations can drive climate action. 1, promoting sustainable practices. 2, reducing carbon emissions. 3, addressing trade-related environmental challenges. And 4, supporting technological transfer. These are all areas that the UWI has already begun to help Caribbean countries with. At the Cave Hill campus, we have worked with the government of Barbados on the island's green economy scope and study, made creative recommendations in relation to sargassum, and developed a body of research on the coastal environment through our Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies. We have also developed programs that are closely aligned to the needs of the region, such as the Masters in International Trade Policy, or MSc in Natural Resource and Environmental Management, and the MSc in Sustainable Energy. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for making the trek from all of your countries to this workshop. I know it's going to be very impactful. I know the policies that we develop here are going to change the trade environment. So with that being said, thank you very much.
And now, very quickly, I'm going to invite Mr. Chris Zambrano, who is the managing partner of EY Caribbean and sponsor of this cocktail, to say a few words as sponsor.
Okay, having observed all protocols, good evening. Right Honorable Prime Minister Amar Motley, Your Excellencies, and distinguished guests. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, speaking on behalf of EY Caribbean, and we're really pleased to be supporting this event as a sponsor and a contributor with our own international trade and climate specialist, Sally Jones, contributing as a participant. There's no doubt to us as laymen that the climate change is an urgent and existential threat for us. For us in the Caribbean, we have experienced it in a tangible and terrifying manner with increasingly extreme and rapidly developing weather events and major changes within our oceans that have devastated our islands' infrastructure and economies. For us, it is fundamental that we take decisive action to address this global crisis. Reflecting on the title of the workshop, Trade and Climate Action, Shifting the Paradigm for a Just Transition and Sustainable Development, climate action is something that is now fundamental in the DNA of EY, both globally and locally. This is not only true for projects such as the cutting-edge work that we have been doing here in Barbados. For example, we did some work with UNIDO and Bloom with respect to the development of Barbados's clean tech industry, supporting our aspiration to become the most environmentally advanced green economy country in Latin America by 2025. But we're also assisting the government of Suriname with their carbon credits and getting approval by the UNFCCC. We believe that climate action needs to be mainstreamed through every service that EY offers to our clients, whether it's a piece of tax advisory with the need to incorporate measures such as plastic packaging taxes and the impact of the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I understand will be a topic of discussion later here this week, through to a supply chain transformation where sustainable sourcing and transport form a fundamental consideration. One of the things we are most interested in this week is to delve beyond the simplistic binary that trade is either good or bad for the environment. We know from our work at EY across every sector of the economy, with clients large and small, none of them will be able to decarbonize their operations and achieve net zero emissions without sourcing talent, inputs, and material from across international borders. Trade is an opportunity to address climate change with the promotion of environmental goods and services. This can include everything from renewable energy technologies to sustainable agriculture and forestry practices. We urgently need a green skills revolution which has so much potential to transform businesses and the lives of individuals. We are also inspired by the Prime Minister's Bridgetown agenda and her dedication to transforming the work of the World Trade Organization and the Bretton Woods institutions to financing climate mitigation and adaptation. Trade finance is an area where we have a long way to go to be supportive of promoting sustainable trade practices. While recent improvements to OECD rules have been positive, government credit agencies need to work with commercial providers and innovative fintechs to address gaps in the market and overhaul regulatory barriers where they exist. We know that international cooperation is essential if we are to effectively address this global crisis and find meaningful solutions. However, it is our hope that as you undertake your deliberations, that you remember that any recommendations need to be used and acted upon by businesses and individuals. We welcome you to our wonderful island and wish you a productive and impactful deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. And now for the real reason we're all here. I suspect she needs no long-winded introduction, but to do her justice, especially to the persons who have never heard her speak in person before, let me just briefly introduce the Prime Minister and our keynote speaker, the Honorable Mia Moore-Motley, SC and Member of Parliament, is the 8th Prime Minister of Barbados and leader of the Barbados Labour Party. She's born in Barbados in 1965. The important thing about her birthday is October. Okay, I get the point. Let me skip that paragraph. All right, let's get to the point. Suffice to say that the Prime Minister is no stranger to these circles, especially the climate circles. Those of you who are here have all been really asking me, is she really coming? So she's here. The Prime Minister is known internationally and regionally for opening in 2021 the climate conference. She has also been trailblazing with the Bridgetown agenda. And as I mentioned, she's also been doing important work on that agenda right here in Barbados as well. Without further ado, let me welcome to the podium Prime Minister Mia Amor Motley to deliver the keynote address for us today.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. Distinguished guests all. Who's in charge of the lights? This is less about lights and more about substance, so can we get the lights turned on, please? First of all, let me say a good afternoon to all of you, and to say that it is indeed my pleasure to be here. You would know that with a day that started at 4 o'clock this morning in addressing climate in Germany, to end at 6 o'clock this evening addressing trade would mean that I would have to be a woman completely committed to a life of madness to even be here, or that this really does matter to us. And it does matter to us. I'm not a trade specialist. I do not pretend to be one. I'm not an economist. I equally do not pretend to be one. But what I am is a person leading a country that, by its own structure and definition, cannot survive in today's world on its own. 166 square miles is literally a dot in the ocean. But yet, for the last almost 400 years, we have effectively been a trade entrepot. Regrettably, for the very wrong reasons at first. Human trafficking, in the worst form that it could happen. Our geography lent us to be a perfect place for that. And in those days, there were no trade rules that would stop people from acting immorally and illegally. But nevertheless, there was a conscience that emerged among humankind that eventually led to the abolition of the slave trade and eventually the emancipation of slaves. I start here because it is important to understand why morally issues of fair trade resonate with us. We cannot be that location that serves the needs of others in pursuit of trade at all costs and not be that country today that is required to pay forward, recognizing that in the same way there is shame upon our country and our parliament for the passage of the 1661 Slave Code, that there is an obligation on us today to speak for a just, fair, global trading system. We cannot exist without trade. But equally, we cannot allow trade and industrial development to be reflected in a shadow that speaks to the domination of a handful of countries or a handful of enterprises at the expense of all others. You may ask, therefore, you're not a trade expert, you're not an economist, why are you speaking to these things that relate to Bridgetown Initiative and relate to the global system and fighting climate? Well, just as we didn't necessarily ask to be brought to this country, we didn't ask for the climate crisis. And note, I do not speak about climate change, but I speak about the climate crisis to be brought upon us. The reality is that whether we like it or not, the very industrial revolution that spawned the wealth of those countries who dominate for the majority of the last 2 centuries literally was paid for by the blood, sweat, and tears of our citizens. That we should now be on the front line of what the Industrial Revolution has spawned is a perfect definition of double jeopardy. And it is for this reason that we believe that the clarion calls that are being made for a just transition and a just industrial strategy for the Global South cannot be relegated simply to be just another voice in the wind, but has now to be seen as a day of reckoning whose time has come. And what is the reckoning? We were told that in the establishment of a global trading system which naturally was being reformed to meet the needs of the time for countries in the 1990s, when they eventually settled at Marrakesh, that this would have been an evolution to make the trading system more fit for purpose. You will forgive me if, as I did in the presidential lecture for the WTO in Geneva last year, reminded us of what the experience has been for small states such as ours with respect to the establishment of the WTO. For those who live in Barbados, it is perhaps a useful story because this country joined the WTO, I believe, on the 6th of April, 1994. And you may ask why I recall it. It is because it was the very year later that year that I entered into the cabinet of Barbados, only to find out that we had been, in our name, committed to a range of obligations that would have serious implications for the flexibility of our government in the conduct of domestic policy for the next few decades. I see one of our leading industrialists here, and he would be able to recall the days when, in 1997, Barbados had 406 companies registered in the manufacturing sector. Today, or I should say in the last few years, even before COVID, when we took our last numbers, the numbers had dropped by 2019 to 231 companies. So this has nothing at all to do with COVID. This has simply to do with the evolution of opportunities and the competitive issues that are necessary to sustain enterprise and trading enterprises. I well remember as well that in addition, that when that sector was at the numbers of 406 companies, that we employed 12,199 people in the manufacturing sector. By the time it dropped to 231, only 6,949 Barbadians are employed in the manufacturing sector just before the start of COVID. The investment in the sector was at its highest just before we left government in 2007, when the new investment was at 66.2 million, and regrettably, those figures have dropped to below $20 million since 2017 going on. In addition to that, the reality is that we were also exporting over $520 million in exports in 2007, and that figure has also significantly dropped. I can capture it as I did in Geneva and let you know that the manufacturing sector had declined by some 34% and the agricultural sector by some 22%. Now, you would ask, therefore, why would you even contemplate wanting to trade in circumstances where the evolution of the World Trade Organization has led to such a sharp decline in domestic output? Bottom line is, we can never make all that we need to sustain life here. And therefore, trade is an essential part of our being as a citizen of a small island developing state. Trade is even more a part of our being if we see ourselves as a large ocean state, because it is trade that literally will ride the waves and bring countries closer together. So the problem is essentially not trade. The problem is the terms and conditions of trade. And I therefore go back to first principles, which my cabinet will tell you I do often. How do we deconstruct and reconstruct to be able to have an environment that is suitable not just to small states like ourselves, but other large developing countries within the global south? And how do we create a more equitable platform? And how do we lower and level the cost of debt? And how do we ensure that what is good in the north will also be good in the east, the west, and the south? And therein lies the crux of the problem. The continued dominance of a few who helped to create these international institutions and who did it in their own image, regrettably did not believe that there was need for a surgical approach to the creation of these institutions. And the notion that a one-size-fits-all rule being appropriate to be able to govern our trade and trade of large countries seemed attractive to most, with very few exceptions to be able to accommodate small states such as ourselves. I was a young member of parliament and minister who heard on many occasions the cry for special and differential treatment for small states in the Caribbean community. The former Prime Minister Owen Arthur cut his teeth as a Prime Minister on these issues, and he never let his cabinet forget what mattered with respect to these issues of foreign trade. The reality is that one of the first reasons that caught our attention as a government to be able to ensure that we hosted UNCTAD here was to be able to start to find how we could create the space, the policy space, the fiscal space, the space to be able to allow us to pursue the development of our people, which internationally we like to call the Sustainable Development Goals, but which for ordinary Bajans simply meant how do we maintain our commitment to educate our citizens, how do we provide access to the health care, how do we help the most vulnerable among us, how do we create the spaces necessary to maintain mental wellness as well, and how do we make sure that there are opportunities for both production locally, but also export of capital and export of services. Unless you are better schooled in many of these things than I am. You have seen the world find a way to make right those things that were wrong and excluded from options for economic and other development. And what do I mean? We were told that there should be no quantitative easing, Professor Moore, that we shouldn't be printing money at will. But when a global crisis hit, the very same G7 countries that told us not to do it through their directors on the various institutions that they serve upon, immediately conceded from not just this crisis, but as far back as 2008-9, that was a legitimate policy instrument for those, particularly those who dominated by being able to issue currency themselves and hold their own currency reserves. Secondly, we were told that special and differential treatment ought not to apply. And even if it was in allowing developing countries to fight among themselves, it was the age-old rule of divide and conquer to maintain the status quo that allowed that dominance to take place. We were told that we could not have any more forms of protection to help us protect domestic manufacturers and domestic farmers. But yet the greatest levels of agricultural subsidies take place where? No different from what we were told with respect to financial services, but just from a different institution. That you should not be seeking to have two different sets of rules, and that you should not be seeking to have a financial services sector that courted to a particular class of enterprise globally, otherwise known usually as multinational corporations. And what did we see in exchange? That the very time when you were going after multinational corporations for trade coming out of the Ukraine-Russia war, where did the majority of confiscations and forfeitures take place? it did not take place in Bridgetown, in spite of the fact that Barbados found itself on multiple gray and black lists, leading to companies having to face enhanced due diligence in order to do business with a country of 300,000 people and a GDP of $6 billion US. There has to be something fundamentally immoral about a global system that does not recognize that a country that does not have the capacity to distort global trade in goods and services ought not to face the same rules as those who see themselves in the middleweight and heavyweight sectors. I refer specifically to the fact that our share in global trade in goods is 0.000%. And our share in global trade in services is 0.001%, with absolutely no capacity to distort. But we become so consumed that we forget to lead. And what happens globally is a myopic approach to the development of policy in almost all of these institutions. By some stretch of the imagination, you would never believe that an executive board director at the World Bank or the IMF also belongs to the same country as the prime minister or president of that country whose name they hold. Because when you listen to the development side of that country, they speak one thing, and when you see the actions of those who sit on the boards, you see another thing. I say the same thing, and perhaps the WTO makes the others look like child's play when it comes to the division of labor and the division of speech in countries as to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. We speak about the importance of human rights and democracy, but yet we can't resolve the issue of who should be adjudicating disputes in the WTO in the third decade of the 21st century. It is a crying shame that we allow ourselves this duplicity of language, but worse than that, duplicity of values. I believe that we have, therefore, as I said, a day of reckoning coming. We get on stage and we talk about net zero commitments. And we talk about net zero commitments to save the planet, not as an academic exercise, but to save the planet. The notion that Pakistan could be where it is today is really of biblical proportions. How many of you thought you would hear about locusts other than reading the Bible? How many people would think that as you look across Africa, that you would see a rising crisis where people cannot sustain themselves and their lives from the living on the land, largely because of an absence of access to water, an incapacity to be able to have food security, and by extension, an inability to attract investment to sustain economic livelihoods of populations. If you doubted what I'm saying and what is happening, take a look at the map of Africa and look and see where the brown is and where it ends, and where the green is and where it starts and where it ends. And we begin to see that we are living in a world that is becoming more and more inhospitable. You look at Australia, you look across Latin America, you start to hear then the conversations relating to groundwater crises and the inability of communities to sustain themselves because of a lack of access to water, and the agricultural production that hitherto would have been associated with that community has now gone out of the window. You start to hear about a world in which people now, in the protection of themselves as if it were the wild, wild west, start to issue export restrictions, as happened during the pandemic, when small countries were denied access to critical goods, pieces of equipment, and therapeutics, and that those who benefited had access to money or power, or in sometimes just power and not even money, because of the scarcity of what was there. The dilemma and the dichotomy as to whether we should aggressively protect intellectual property and earn from it, or exclude those who need access to the goods that are protected and are inflated as a result of the intellectual property, remains an age-long discussion that will continue to haunt us. But in the absence of the transfer of technology, and in the absence of the transfer of financing that is affordable, available, and accessible, it is no longer a moot point, because there is, for one side of the equation, a benefit, and for the other, on the other side of the equation, in the east, west, and south, a deficit. Human civilization is just a collection of countries. And across the history of countries, we have seen when inequity leads ultimately to evolution and revolution. We either will manage the evolution of trade and the evolution of the economics of the world in which we live, or there will be a disruptive change with us having little control over it. You cannot expect countries to continue to face the reality of having to finance development with short-term capital. It cannot be easier for our citizens to secure a mortgage for 30 years than it is for a country to secure a loan to build hospitals, to build schools, or to build institutions and infrastructure. Something is fundamentally wrong when the entire financial system sees itself in terms of short-term returns, short-term earnings, short-term investments, and when we sit idly back and want to control trade, but do not want to say anything to people who are buying back shares to consolidate wealth and ownership in international, multinational corporations. The day of reckoning is coming for us. And the day of reckoning will demand that when we deconstruct and reconstruct, that we do so with a moral compass, that we do so with a recognition that there has to be fairness and equity, that there has to be a transition that allows for the transfer of knowledge, and that this notion that the evolution of global trade and services can be dealt with by these wonderful constructs of who will accredit who and who will do this, and then when we actually get to it, the stumbling blocks, the difficulties, the delays, the costs, the complexity mean that the equation is still in balance between those who benefit from the opening up of markets and those who suffer because they do not have the institutional capacity or the fiscal capacity to do that which is necessary to level the playing field for the trade in goods, trade and services that was to be our bounty as independent nations. The geopolitical madness of the world in which we live has also now meant that the issue of not just efficient supply chains is on the table, but more importantly, secure and resilient supply chains. And secure and resilient mean different things to different people. So let us be clear, first of all, that we do not start on a level playing field as it relates to definitions. But against that backdrop, geopolitics is raising its head again. And against that backdrop, therefore, the efficiency and the fairness of the trading system will be put on trial. Those of you who are gathered here are being asked to go where others have not gone sufficiently, consistently, and to the end, to deconstruct and to reconstruct a global trading system that works for the least among us, while at the same time still keeping engaged and interested those who have capacity and reach. It is not easy. But what is required is an assessment of risk and an assessment of opportunity, an assessment of access to capital, technology, and for once, a level of honesty that says that a world that finds it easy to make the movement of money as easy as the making of a call or the pressing of a button cannot seriously now still be insisting that the movement of people be as iniquitous and as degrading as the movement of people were at the settlement, the modern settlement of countries like my own? How is it possible for us to understand how capital can move freely in a global trading system, but not people? Why don't we see them? And why don't we make some kind of provision that allows for it, particularly with those countries that have huge demographic dividends ahead of them or in the middle of them, but at the same time, the hallmark of many developed countries, and some developing like my own, is a declining and aging population that cannot sustain the levels of growth and cannot maintain the integrity and stability of the social security systems that we have. These are all very highly technical issues. And I have come here not with answers, but simply with challenges. You need to be able to help right-size the world, but in a moral way that for the first time removes the dominance that existed from the time Columbus came to the Americas and determined that the world should be divided in the image of a few countries. You need to also be able to allow us to do that while pursuing that which is the legitimate right of every citizen born on this planet, to be able to have access to opportunities for development, basic things. And very often we find ourselves now dealing with the consolidation, and believe you me, I have no difficulty with companies or people making money, but I have a difficulty with others being excluded to the point of privation in a way that does not allow your conscience to rest when you see what they have to go through. With respect to our own country, why has Barbados chosen to fight these battles? Because whether we like it or not, if we don't fight these battles, we become shaped by the lack of policy space and the lack of fiscal space that then deprives us from being able to secure the development of the people from St. Lucie to St. Philip, from St. James to St. John. And we therefore recognize that if we are truly to be treated as sovereign nations, then our word must count at some point. And while our word singularly will not mean a lot as a small nation, our word collectively with other small nations can make that definable difference. And at this time, when the world is trying to right-size what the next 5 to 10 years may look like coming out of this polycrisis moment, there could never be a more opportune time for deconstructing and reconstructing the institutions that shape our world and shape the possibilities for our development. I hope that as we do so, we recognize that the hypocrisy that has allowed do as I say and not as I do to be the dominant feature of the manner in which the G7 and the industrialized world has dealt with generally the global south will become a thing, a conversation piece for the past, but not an aspect of our future development. At the same time, we are sanguine enough to know that the needs of developing countries vary significantly, and that variation in the needs of developing countries is perhaps what is responsible equally for there being little or no progress on things that ought to have been settled last 2 decades ago. It is going to require each of us leaving something on the table. And if there was one beautiful thing about the climate, is that it does not discriminate positively for anyone. The bottom line is we have not found a way to live on Mars or Pluto as yet. And therefore, to that extent, there has to be a commitment that we use the common principle that the more people can come to the table, the less weight individually is carried by those who are least capable of carrying weight. It's a very simple premise that we use with our children. It is a very simple value that we reinforce and nurture with our children. And we simply say in Barbados, share the burden and share the bounty. When the time comes for the heavy lifting, all men and women on deck. And when the time comes for the bounty, all men and women on the deck. The world needs such a similar moment. And whether we like it or not, the longer we take to achieve it, the worse it will be, because there will be more countries marginalized by the climate crisis. That Wyoming could come within 30 degrees of the temperature on Mars is nothing to laugh about, but should cause us all to pause. That Third World's monumental and epic song, they were here Friday night playing, and don't know how many of you got to come in early enough to hear them. But those who know Third World would know of that great song, 96 Degrees in the Shade, which for us as young people defined, as they said then, real hot. We now learned that real hot is not 96 degrees in the shade. Real hot is more like 108 and 110 degrees in London and Paris. And we know that that may not be the limit of where it goes. We have a duty to have the conversations as a matter of urgency. This morning in Germany, I left on the table a few things that I leave here today with you as well. Because whether we like it or not, these countries who need help on the front line of the climate crisis cannot only be borrowing money and increasing debt to fight a battle that we did not bring on ourselves. Indeed, far from that, we need to ensure not only longer-term financing, not only cheaper financing, but we also need to ensure that we are in a position to be able to create structures that will allow for transfer of technology, transfer of skills, both ways, and an ability to be able to integrate the Global South into the global economy on a basis that makes sense and not one that resembles more a casino-type environment as to who wins and who loses. I believe that the collection of brain power at this conference can add significant value to the work that we are doing with the Bridgetown Initiative. And this morning in Germany, we indicated to them that we felt that there were a few things that would be necessary to be able to divert away from just debt, but ensure that countries also have access to monies in a loss and damage fund. I want to say from the outset that we need to put the issue of liability one side, because the lawyers will stop us from even having the discussion if we focus on liability. And that we need to remind the lawyers and the politicians and the governments that there is such a thing as capped liability, even if you wanted to maintain liability. But what is necessary are not issues of liability so much to be discussed, but that countries cannot afford to recover from these crises by borrowing more and incurring debt for the climate crisis, crowding out the space that they need to incur debt for in terms of education, healthcare, and normal SDGs. Whether we like it or not, we need to accept the fact that there are more, that the number of multinational corporations whose balance sheet exceeds more than half the countries of the world is significant. You cannot resolve the maintenance of a global commons without a global governance framework. And in the same way that you needed a global governance framework to manage currency risk and balance of payments, in the same way that you wanted a global governance framework to manage trade, even if unfairly so, we need a global governance framework to manage the global commons. And that governance framework doesn't need a new institution. It just needs us to repurpose existing institutions in the same way that the WTO was repurposed from the GATS to meet an evolving climate. I speak specifically to the World Bank, and I speak specifically to the World Bank in partnership with the various other institutions, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how strong and how wealthy you are in the middle of a pandemic, because the smallest nation and the smallest amount of people among us can put at risk the entire health of the planet. It doesn't matter in a climate crisis. And I would like to suggest that war has its ability to cause that kind of difficulty as well. But the precursor to war is bright, idle people. And bright, idle people who have been deprived of education, who have been deprived of opportunity for entrepreneurship, constitute the army that will make the world insecure and the threats for terrorism that will come in regions if we are not careful. It will lead to further migration, and unless we find a better way of managing migration and allowing for mobility of people, then we are going to continue with the cultural wars and the kind of division and divisiveness that will lead otherwise successful countries to become unstable. I didn't come here to be a prophet of gloom and doom, but equally, I would have much rather to be living in a world that does not resemble the world of 100 years ago. We know better. We have gone through worse. And it is up to those of us who can first frame out the possible, which is most of you as academics, as practitioners, to tee it up for the possible, for the governments, and then to get the governments not to speak with forked tongue, not to believe that the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Ministries of Finance and the Treasury belong in a different cocoon part of a country from the rest of the country that sees development and that speaks to fairness and equity and human rights. You cannot talk about a country breaching human rights if you are prepared to sustain the hypocrisy and the dichotomy of a colonial world which did not see people, hear people, or feel people. I pray that Barbados will give you the inspiration to shoot for the stars. I pray that Barbados will give you the inspiration to allow us to remind the world that what is needed now is not more understanding of intricate trade rules, but is a moral compass and is global moral strategic leadership. And if we can look into the mirror and find that part of the pathway that allows us to pursue leadership that is anchored in morals, leadership that is strategic to meet the immediate challenges so that we are not exhausted trying to do everything and to be everything to everyone, and leadership that is global because the global reality is now our village, then I believe that we can summon the courage and the willpower to do that which others did 75 years ago with the benefit of the loss of lives in their back. We should not have to lose tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of lives to do the right thing. Let Barbados and the Bridgetown Initiative give you the inspiration to help this world create a fairer and more just system for trading, recognizing that the green transition is going to create the economic activity that is necessary. As I said last week at the UN, it is not just the right thing and the moral thing to do. It is actually a good development strategy for the Global South. It is actually a good development strategy for the planet. Thank you.
You know, People who usually are mistress or masters of ceremonies try to sum up what was said. I will not even attempt. I think the gravitas of the message was well received, moving. Prime Minister, I can't think of a better way to bring to the participants the gravity of the situation. But I choose also to remind them of 3 or 4 sound bites that I hope will guide us in the next 2 to 3 days. We need to deconstruct and reconstruct. We need to frame up the rules for what is possible. That's our job. We're not just academics. And actually, one of the ethos of our workshops is we're not here to debate academics. We're here to use our collective power and knowledge of the trading system to be powerful forces of change. And the third sort of zingers was morality, fairness. Prime Minister, you put that at the center of the moral compass, and I almost feel like coming to the meeting tomorrow with a compass, and when we start going off, I'll say, we're off track. The Prime Minister told us to stay on track with morality, fairness for the Global South and for the world. You did say, Prime Minister, and I know you have to leave us shortly, that when you started the remarks, you were not a trade expert, you were not an economist. As a parting gift, in order to do just a little bit of assistance in making you more of a tradie, I've asked Dan and Joel to bring with them their finest pieces of work that we will share with you in your, when you can't sleep at night, what better to do but read about trade? And Dan will share with you what is the Bible of Trade and Environment in the 1990s, a book called Greening the GATT that he wrote to explain how the environmental concerns all the way back in the 1990s should be integrated into the DNA of the world trading system. Dan? And Joel has also brought with him 2 books. The Future of International Law, which I'm sure you will voraciously consume. And the second one, which I think the other people in an argument with you will need, which is Tools of the Argument. How the best lawyers think, argue, and win. You don't need that. You don't need that, Prime Minister, but we still thought you could give it to your worthy opponents in debate. Just from Joel. And my book is forthcoming. Prime Minister, I know you and your team have been up since 4 a.m., and although we invite you to remain to socialize, if possible, with the participants, we understand completely if you will have to leave early. That brings us to the end of this short, but I hope very effective, I'm sure very effective, keynote and opening welcome ceremony. Let me start, first of all, in my thanks and closing to the Prime Minister, formidable Prime Minister, her staff who have conspired to get her here. Jonathan, Jessica, thank you all so very much. I see Avinash Prasad as well, her climate envoy, and all of those who work closely with her. My deputy principal, who with the principal I know was wondering why I'm always asking for leave. I hope this goes a little way in explaining what I've been doing for the past 6 months. And thank you to the University of the West Indies, and a lot of the management is here. Thank you for being here and always facilitating the work we're doing and preparing us also for this workshop. Let me thank the sponsors, collaborators of the project. In the pamphlet, at the tail end of the pamphlet, you will see all of the project and event sponsors, and let me in particular mention OSF, Open Society Foundations, who have brought us here, Ernst & Young, who will feed and drink us at the cocktail, regional local sponsors, Canary, West Indies Rum Distilleries, the Barbados Museum, the general sponsors and partners of the project. Again, Dan mentioned them. I also wanted to thank Ken Mbeva and Chris Bellman, who helped with the conceptualization, as well as Tom and Carolyn, who isn't here, with the team in thinking of the topics for this workshop. Let me also express the thanks to the teams at the Hilton for working closely with us, and the team at the Srinath Ramphal Center, I don't know if you're in the room, who have been formidable in executing this project with me, Claudzel, Tanil, Adila, Desiree, Andre, in particular. Let me also thank the local community who has come here, the business community, the ministers, Minister Strawn, Minister Husbands, Governor. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'd also like to thank the business community. I see Busy Williams, I see Sir Paul, I see also Representative Rennie, I see Tricia. I don't want to name all the names, but all of you who are here, and in particular, those who have shown the Barbadian hospitality. Sir Paul, thank you to our guests, and Sir Trevor, I don't know if he's here. Let me also thank the participants. Can you please just stand up so in the cocktail people can come to you? The participants of the workshop who have traveled here, and the local participants as well. Kay, Carlos, I see as well, Cook, Professor Moore, all of you who are local and those who have come from far and wide to be here. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome, welcome. I'd ask you to engage with the local community who's gathered here as well, and enjoy the cocktails, because soon after we'll start working at the dinner session tonight at 7:30. The workshop participants, we will start, and we will hear from Professor Avinash about the Bridgetown agenda and why it should inspire us in trade. So thank you all very much. Thanks to those of you from the media who are covering it, and we wish you all the very best. Thank you very much for being here, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.